Ah, snug lie those that slumber beneath conviction's roof. Their floors are steady lumber, their windows weatherproof. But I sleep cold forever, and cold sleep all my kind. For I was born to shiver in the draught from an open mind. This poem by Phyllis McGinley may make being a critical thinker sound a little scary. But don't be alarmed. While the poem has a lot of truth to it, because seeing the world as it is can be uncomfortable at times, I still believe seeing things as they are is far better than cocooning ourselves in a fantasy world and remaining children forever. Not seeing the world as it is can cause many problems, as you will find illustrated throughout the text. The story on page 8 is especially poignant to me, about these young people who fell to their death in Yosemite. I was at Yosemite that day and had been to that waterfall earlier the day. I have to say that it did not even occur to me to go past the guardrail. The water was very high that summer because the previous winter there had been extra heavy snow, and that water was moving. These visitors' failure of judgment came from arrogance. The rules don't apply to me, but perhaps also a failure to truly observe what was right in front of them. The warning sign, the guardrail, the powerfully flowing waterfall, all the other people staying back. Observation skills are the foundation for good thinking. If you do not see what is actually there, then there is no way you will be able to solve a problem, build a good argument, or evaluate someone else's argument. Seeing is not always easy though, believe it or not. We have a bias against seeing the obvious. We are often searching for hidden meanings at the expense of seeing what is right in front of us. Don't be afraid to be dumb and state the obvious. Often, that is the most important element of a situation. Edward de Bono, a pioneer in the field of critical thinking, writes about perception in his book De Bono's Thinking Course. Outside highly technical matter, perception is by far the most important part of thinking. Perception is how we look at the world, what things we take into account, how we structure the world. Professor David Perkins at Harvard has shown that almost all errors of thinking are errors of perception. In real life, logical errors are quite rare, yet we persist in thinking that thinking is all a matter of avoiding logical errors. In the early days of computing, there was a simple acronym, GIGO, which stands for garbage in, garbage out. This meant that even if the computer was working flawlessly, then what you got out was rubbish if what you put in was rubbish. Exactly the same thing applies to logic. If your perception is limited, then flawless logic will give you an incorrect answer. Bad logic makes for bad thinking. Everyone would agree with that. But the opposite is not true at all. Good logic does not make for good thinking. If the perception is poor, then good logic will give you a faulty answer. There is even the added danger that good logic will give you a false arrogance with which to hold the false answer. This last bit about false arrogance is what I was talking about in last week's notes about too much certainty. To go back to the Hitler example, if you perceived that there were a lot of economic problems and hardships in pre-war Germany, which was true, then you would logically want to find a solution to those problems. But if you then perceived that the source of those problems was the presence of Jews in the country, then logically you would want to get rid of those Jews. It is quite logical, but the perception that underlies that logic is faulty. The fault is obvious to us in America and in hindsight. But what faulty perceptions are we being sucked into today that we will be ashamed of 50 or 60 years from now? Our text presents an expert consensus on what critical thinking is, on page 7, and a wonderful rubric for evaluating thinking, on page 12. The thing to remember, though, is that the basic method we use to think critically is creating and evaluating arguments. We will come back to this concept over and over in this course, but for now we just need a basic introduction. In regular life, we tend to think of an argument as a dispute where one person says one thing and another person disagrees. This often leads to a rise in volume and sometimes serious bad feelings. In critical thinking, however, an argument is simply a claim and the reasons that support that claim. For example, I have already made the claim that too much certainty in the world causes violence. I didn't just make that claim and leave it at that, though. I supported the claim with examples about the September 11th hijackers, people who attack homosexuals, Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, and Germany under Hitler. Because I made a claim and supported it with reasons, it is now an argument. An argument is not the truth, however. Even though I am the teacher of this course, I can be, and often am, wrong. The argument is my attempt to convince you to believe my claim. There are many other arguments out there for why the world is so violent. It is up to you to evaluate which is the strongest. This is what the Holistic Critical Thinking Scoring Rubric, or HCTSR, is all about. The student essays in the text that you are asked to evaluate are arguments, as all essays are. Some of these arguments are better than others. Using the rubric to evaluate them is a way of quantifying how good or bad the arguments are. And this is irrespective of whether you agree with them or not. Be sure to practice using the rubric as you read the chapter and ask questions about anything you don't understand. Next week, you will have a graded writing assignment in which you apply the rubric. So the method of critical thinking is to create and evaluate arguments. Behind this method, there are a couple of basic ideas that should guide you. The first is that the only way you can evaluate an argument is to see that there are also other possible arguments that may be equally valid. This means that you need to be open-minded enough to at least realize there are other arguments out there, even if you disagree with them. The second idea is that what we are trying to do when practicing critical thinking is to make the unconscious conscious. Once our thinking is conscious, it can be evaluated by commonly accepted standards of good thinking. My favorite definition of critical thinking is by Dr. Richard Paul, founder of the Center for Critical Thinking, based at Sonoma State University. He's the author of your 3 Kinds of Questions handout. He says that critical thinking is thinking about our thinking in order to improve our thinking. In this case, this is not circular reasoning, but rather illustrates that critical thinking is a recursive, which is to say, somewhat circular process. This is where the self-regulatory part of the consensus definition on page 7 comes in, and is expressed visually on page 30. When, as a critical thinker, I evaluate someone else's thinking, say to decide whether Obama's Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, was a good one, I then have to evaluate my own evaluation. Am I being biased because I already have good health insurance, because I dislike Democrats or Republicans, because Obama is black? These would probably be unconscious biases on my part, and as a critical thinker, my job is to ferret them out and make them conscious, so that I can decide if they are valid criteria, or if I should throw them away, or at least try to set them aside, so I can make a better founded evaluation. Once we make the unconscious conscious, so we can see what our own arguments are for our own beliefs, then we can examine other arguments on the same topic, realizing that our own views are not the only ones out there. Only then can we fairly evaluate which argument is most sound, using all the skills and attitudes of a good critical thinker that are outlined in Chapter 2, summarized on page 38. I think all of us can do good thinking when we know what we're dealing with, but when we don't question the ideas and feelings and biases that underlie our conscious thought, then it's like we're trying to work with one arm tied behind our backs. It is important to do all the reading from the textbook this semester. Given that we do not meet in class, these lectures, the textbook, and our discussion on the discussion page are the class. I have not required the purchase of my thinking lab, so you will not always have access to online materials referred to in the text. However, many of these materials are freely available online and are easily found with a quick search. I will try to give you links to some of the more interesting and important resources. I do think it is critical, to do your reading in front of or near a computer or at least a smartphone, both to access these online resources that are referred to in the text, but also to be able to look up words and ideas that you may not be familiar with. This book will not talk down to you by using simplified language, so please get in the habit of looking things up. In the notes, I have links to some of the videos that are referred to in the chapter. I wasn't able to find all of them, but many of them are available if you look in the notes. The assignments for this week are, the first is to read chapters 1 and 2 and pick any of the group discussion or thinking critically questions from any part of either chapter or in the review section, and answer the question using some organized, reflective thinking with specific and concrete detail, and post that on the discussion page. Please follow all the guidelines in the syllabus for your discussion page postings.